Do you want to understand how to write a good character arc for your protagonist? Well, then this video is for you. What's up, guys? Dave Jacobson here, best-selling author and book publisher, and this is a multi-part series in which I'm teaching you step by step from beginning to end how to write a fictional novel. I've already looked at a number of steps in the previous videos. If you haven't watched them yet, I encourage you to go back and take a look at them in order. This is a step-by-step story development process that I developed over the years. I've been writing novels and books for decades now. And if you're someone who gets stuck, right, you don't know how to outline a book, you don't know how to develop the story, or maybe, you get a lot of writer's block, well, then this series is dedicated for you. So without further ado, guys, we're going to get into this particular part of the series. I'm going to shrink my melon-sized head here, and we're going to get right into it. So as you can see here, I created this step-by-step story development process. I'm not going to reiterate every step in this video. We're going to focus today on developing a character arc. But just if you're just joining us, just for review, I just wanted to point out what we've done so far. Okay, so step one, we created a working title for our book. And go back and watch the video to see why that's important to start with that as step one. The title we chose was Dead in Breakfast. Then we moved on to step two, where we loosely described our protagonist and our antagonist. Okay, those are the forces that sort of fight each other, right? And that therefore there's a conflict that arises between them in your story. Okay, so we learned all about what that is and how to develop it in step two. Then we moved on to step three, which was just basically giving the protagonist and antagonist a working name. Step four, we gave our protagonist some qualities that made them likable or easy to sympathize with, right? Again, go back and watch these other videos, guys, if you want to know exactly how to do this stuff and why it's important. I'm not going to sort of reinvent the wheel because these videos are already out there. Step five, we stated the conflict of our story, okay? And I've been providing examples from Harry Potter all along. Then in step six, we created the premise of our story, okay? Go back and watch that video if you're unfamiliar with how to create a premise. And we're doing all this stuff in order because there's a method to the madness, guys. If you don't know who your protagonist is, for example, you cannot develop a good premise because your premise is going to involve your protagonist, right? So we're doing this stuff in order. The next thing we looked at was the opening setting of your story. If you don't have a great setting for your story and don't know how to develop that, watch that video. And then the next thing we did in step 8 was to give our protagonist a character flaw. Why was that important? Well, if you don't have a flaw, then you're not going to be able to have a character arc. And I'm going to explain that in a minute in step 9. Okay? But go back and watch that video if you don't know how to write a character flaw for your character and what that is. But now brings us up to speed, and here we are on step 9 in my my story development process, which is to define your protagonist's character arc. Okay? So this video is just going to focus mostly on just this topic, how to write a good character arc for your protagonist. But before I show you exactly how to do that and give you my exact strategy for how I develop a character arc, let's talk a little bit about what a character arc is, okay? Because some of you may not know. Well, a character arc in a story basically just refers to the transformation or journey that a character undergoes, particularly concerning their internal state and personality as they experience the events of the narrative. Okay, so why is this important? Well, when we watch somebody like our protagonist go through a series of events during a book or a movie, we want to see that person change, okay? Stagnation is not very interesting for a number of reasons. One of the main reasons is if you're writing a good story, if you've got a good plot, right, then there's going to be a lot of stuff happening. And we talked a little bit about conflict in the previous videos, but basically if there's no conflict in your story, there's really no story, okay? If I say, hey, here's my book. Johnny went to the store and everything went great. It's not really a story. It's just an event. It's like something that happened. A story is more like Johnny was on his way to the store and aliens came down and started trying to shoot at him, and he had to dodge those bullets, and it was very hard to get to the store. And eventually there were some cars that he had to dodge on the way, and eventually, after all of these horrible circumstances that he faced, he was able to make it to the store victoriously, right? Now it's starting to look more like a story because we have conflict, we have events, we have external forces and potentially internal forces that are getting in the way of the character getting what they want, right? Which in the case of this little story, micro story, was going to the store, right? So if all of these ordeals are happening, right? If your character is experiencing all of these obstacles in the way of getting toward their goal, well, we want to believe that's happening for a reason. It's just hardwired in who we are as humans to believe that things happen for a reason. And the reason in storytelling is the transformation that happens during a character arc. Okay, so if we see that, during that process of Johnny going to the store, he became like a hero. He discovered his own courage. He learned how to defeat the aliens, and all these other things happen to him. He becomes a better person in the end, right? That is a more satisfying story than if no change happens whatsoever, right? So that's why we give our protagonist character arcs, because it makes the story more satisfying to the reader. Okay, so let's just read this definition a little bit more. Character arc is a change in the beliefs, values, or emotional state that often reflects a deeper understanding of themselves or the world around them. Okay, so often the character is going to develop a deeper understanding, right? They're going to be more knowledgeable. They're going to know more. They're going to be maybe there's a shift in their beliefs or values or their emotional state by the end of the story. Okay, so that's what a character arc is. Now, how do we write a good character arc for our story? Okay, so now if you've gone through all the steps, step by step, 1 through 8 up until now, you've got your protagonist, you know something about them, you know who they are, you know what they want, you know what's preventing them from getting that, so you know the conflict, you know the premise of the story, you know a lot of different things, and one of the things you know is, because we defined this in the previous step, in step 8, is you know the character flaw, okay? You have to know the character flaw before you can write the character arc. And you're going to see why in just a second, okay? But for our example, our protagonist is named Callie, that we're sort of creating as we go along here, because we're writing a story together to make it more fun and interesting. And we said that Callie is notably irresponsible, right? So she's a tween. This is a middle grade book. In terms of the example I'm giving. And so, she's 11 or 12 years old, and as many people her age are, she's irresponsible, right? So one of the things we looked at when writing character arcs, make them believable. And this person's a teenager, so it's very believable that Callie would be irresponsible. She hates doing chores, and this can create conflict in our story because we said in a previous step that there's going to be this agency called the Department of Spectral Affairs, right? And they come to do audits to the Dead and Breakfast, which is this business run by her parents. And so if she's not doing her chores, if she's not cleaning the bed linens and things like that, then her parents' hotel or Airbnb, or rather Scarebnb, can be shut down by this organization. So you can see how this character flaw is going to create conflict, right? Okay, now we have our character flaw, so now we can define our character arc. How are we going to do that? Well, to do this, choose one of your protagonist's character flaws, okay, that we just created. Then note at the beginning of the story, your protagonist must have that flaw. And by the end of the story, your protagonist will overcome that flaw. Okay, so now you see the relationship between the character flaw and the character arc. The character flaw is what your protagonist overcomes or gets rid of by the end of the story, and that creates the character arc, right? So let's do this together. To complete the step, I've devised this sentence that you can fill out and just literally fill in the blanks to give yourself a character arc. At the beginning of the story, blank, okay, Callie, in our case, has the following character flaw, blank. Okay, we already defined our character flaw in the previous step. And if you haven't done that, go back and watch all the other videos to figure out exactly how to do that. But once you have the character flaw, which in her case is being irresponsible, okay, this makes it nearly impossible for her to defeat the protagonist because the antagonist is the Department of Spectral Affairs, and they expect her parents to have the bed and breakfast immaculate and in good order, right? So if Callie isn't doing her chores, if she's not cleaning the bed linens, then she cannot defeat the DSA who wants to shut her business down, her parents' business down, right? So that now we're starting to see the relationship between the character flaw and that conflict that results, and why it becomes impossible to defeat the antagonist until the character flaw is gotten rid of, right? So there's a relationship between the protagonist being able to get their desire, right? In this case, Callie wants to save her parents' dead and breakfast business. There's a relationship between her being able to do that and not having this character flaw, right? So again, think of the story as a crucible in which there's all these external and internal forces that are getting in the way of what the character wants, what your protagonist wants. And the number one internal circumstance getting in the way is the character flaw of the protagonist, him or herself, right? So because they have this character flaw, they can't get what they want. And that forces us in our storytelling to figure out a way to have the circumstances change our character so that they get rid of their character flaw, and then very rewardingly for the reader, overcome the antagonist. Okay? So before the end of the story, she must learn, or he or she learns to become responsible, in our case, right? Fill in the blanks, which enables her to rise to the occasion and defeat the antagonist. So you can see how this all works together, guys, okay? And you can see why I'm going through the steps in the order that I am. If you hadn't defined your character flaw in the previous step, then you couldn't complete this step. Okay, let's take a look at an example here. And let's talk about Harry Potter, okay? Because most people have read that. Well, so what is the character arc in Harry Potter? Well, in Harry Potter, at the beginning of the story, the protagonist has the following character flaw. He does not yet understand his own agency, worth, or place in the world. Right? If you've ever read the book, it's this little boy who lives under, in the I think the cupboard, right? And he doesn't really understand that he's a wizard. He doesn't understand that he's very powerful. He doesn't understand that he has the ability to, rise up to the occasion and do things. He doesn't understand magic yet. So all these things are built into his character flaw at the beginning of the story. Okay, and because he doesn't understand magic, he doesn't even know that he's a wizard, this makes it nearly impossible for him to defeat the antagonist, Voldemort, because he begins as an isolated, uninformed child who has been trained to think of himself as unwanted, powerless, and ordinary in the worst possible sense, right? He does not know the truth about his past, the magical world, the antagonist, or the reason he actually matters. Okay, but before the end of the story, he learns that he is not defined by the cruelty of the people who raised him, nor by fame, bloodline, or power, but by his choices, loyalty, courage, and capacity for love, right? And once he learns this, once he overcomes his character flaws, that's what enables him to rise to the occasion and defeat the antagonist's immediate plan, because he chooses to protect others even when he is frightened, outmatched, and alone, right? So you can see how this all works. Now, put concisely, at the beginning, the protagonist is an unwanted child who does not understand his own worth or power. By the end, he becomes an active defender of his chosen world, willing to risk himself for friends and for the truth, proving that love and courage can withstand power built on fear. Okay, so you can see, I just gave you an example of what a good character arc looks like, right? And I gave you an exact formula for how you can create one yourself. Guys, if you're getting value out of this, I consider you watching. I would ask you to consider watching the other steps. Subscribe, hit that alert bell so you'll know when I put out the next video. Like, comment, and I'll see you in the next one.